The drive from downtown Boston to my mother's house in Chestnut Hill takes 23 minutes on a good day. I took 45. Not because of traffic. Because I sat in a parking lot off the expressway for 22 minutes, engine idling, watching my own breath fog the windshield, running through the arithmetic of what I was about to walk into and deciding, with the cold precision that had made me extraordinarily good at my actual job, that I was ready. I was wearing a fleece I'd bought at a Goodwill in Somerville for $8. My car was a 2019 Civic with a coffee stain on the passenger seat. My boots were sensible and unremarkable and had been purchased on sale at a DSW 3 winters ago. I looked, in other words, exactly like what my family had decided I was, a woman in her mid-30s who had never quite figured it out. What I was, in fact, was the anonymous majority shareholder, founder, and acting CEO of Callaway Ridge Capital, a private equity and technology investment firm with a managed portfolio valued at just over $3 billion. But that night, I was just Doris. The disappointing one. The one who'd never come back from whatever it was that had happened to her after she left the family business. I pulled out of the parking lot and finished the drive. My name is Doris Voss. And before I tell you what happened inside that house on the night of December 23rd, I need to tell you about the family I was walking into, because context is everything when you're doing a final audit. My mother, Diane, is the kind of woman who measures love in appearances. Not maliciously, exactly. It's more structural than that, the way certain buildings are designed without exits, not to trap anyone, just because exits weren't part of the original vision. She had raised 3 children in that house in Chestnut Hill, and she had a clear, unwavering ranking of them that she had never once tried to hide. First was my brother, Preston. Preston was 40, handsome in the particular way of men who've always been told they're handsome, and the president of Voss Family Investments, the mid-sized asset management firm our father had built over 30 years before his death. Preston had run the company for 6 years. He had the title, the salary, the corner office, and the framed magazine profile on his wall. He was, in our mother's words, everything your father would have wanted. Second was my younger sister, Claudette, who had married a cardiothoracic surgeon and lived in a 5-bedroom colonial in Wellesley. Claudette's primary function at family gatherings was to provide ambient evidence that the family was doing well. She did this faithfully and without apparent effort. Third was me. I had left Voss Family Investments 9 years ago under circumstances my mother described as Doris going through one of her phases and the rest of the family described, depending on how charitable they were feeling, as either a breakdown, a betrayal, or simply proof that I had always been the difficult one. What actually happened was simpler and less dramatic. I had identified a fundamental problem with the way my father's firm was allocating capital, brought it to Preston with a detailed analysis, been dismissed in a meeting that lasted 11 minutes, and decided that I would go build something that proved the analysis correct. I did. It took 4 years to get the first fund to close, 2 more to generate returns significant enough to stop eating anxiety for breakfast, and 3 more to reach the point where Callaway Ridge Capital was the kind of firm that other firms wanted to be when they grew up. I had not told my family. This was not an accident. The house smelled like evergreen and Diane's standing rib roast, which she made every December 23rd without variation, a ritual so fixed it had become almost geological. My cousin Marcus answered the door. He was a decent man who had always been kind to me in the cautious way of people trying not to take sides in a conflict they don't fully understand. Doris. Hey. He hugged me. You look good. Thanks, Marcus. You too. Preston's in the living room. Big announcement tonight, apparently. Your mom's about to explode with happiness. I smiled and stepped inside. The living room was full of the particular noise of a family that believes it is celebrating. Preston stood near the fireplace in a cashmere sweater that cost more than my rent, or rather, more than the rent of the studio apartment in Cambridge I maintained specifically for occasions like this one, a modest, verifiable address that matched the image I'd been carefully tending for years. He saw me and his smile did the thing it always did, widened fractionally before settling into something that wasn't quite warmth. Doris. You made it. Merry Christmas, Preston. You look tired. He said it with the specific concern of someone who wants you to know they've noticed you're diminished. How's the consulting work going? Still doing the freelance analysis stuff? It keeps me busy, I said, which was technically true in the way that saying the ocean keeps you wet is technically true. Diane appeared from the kitchen with the focused radiance of a woman whose evening is going according to plan. She kissed my cheek. Sweetheart. I'm so glad you came. A pause, barely perceptible, the punctuation of a woman making sure I understood the hierarchy of her gladness. Preston has the most wonderful news. So I hear. She squeezed my arm and moved past me toward Preston with the gravitational certainty of a planet and its sun. I got myself a glass of water and found a chair near the window. The announcement came after dinner, before dessert, in the way of someone who has been planning the staging. Preston stood at the head of the table, our father's chair, which he had occupied without comment or ceremony exactly 6 years ago and which no one had ever mentioned, and waited for the table to quiet. I wanted to share something with all of you before Christmas, he said. Because this is a family achievement, not just a personal one. He paused to let the weight of that land. Voss Family Investments has been selected as the anchor manager for the Hartwell Endowment reallocation. $230 million under management. The table erupted. Diane pressed her hands to her chest. Claudette clapped. Marcus whistled. Various cousins and their spouses produced the sounds of people reacting to large numbers. That's the biggest institutional mandate we've ever won, Preston continued, his voice modulated to the register of a man being appropriately humble about something he is not humble about at all. It validates everything Dad built. And I wanted to be with family when I shared it. More applause. I applauded too. My hands moved together in the way of someone whose expression is carefully managed. What I knew, that no one else at that table knew, was that Callaway Ridge Capital was the second largest outside investor in the Hartwell Endowment's technology allocation. I had been in 2 meetings with the Hartwell trustees in the past 18 months. I knew their investment committee chairman personally. I knew, because I had access to information that my position afforded me, that the mandate Preston was celebrating had been structured specifically to pair an institutional anchor manager with firms in our region, and that my firm's presence in the endowment had been a quiet factor in the trustees' confidence in the Boston market. Preston's biggest win, in other words, had been made marginally easier by the invisible woman at the end of his table. I smiled and raised my glass when Diane proposed the toast. The cruelty, when it came, was so practiced that I almost admired its efficiency. It happened in the kitchen, after the dessert plates had been cleared, in that hour of a family gathering when guards drop and true feelings surface like sediment after the water stills. Diane was at the sink. Claudette was beside her. I was refilling my water glass when Diane said, with her back to me, in the tone of someone having a conversation they're pretending not to have, I worry about her, Claudette. I really do. At her age, your father and I had built something real. Preston has built something real. Even you have your family, your home. Doris just drifts. Claudette murmured something sympathetic. I've been talking to Preston about it, Diane continued. Your Uncle Bart left a small amount in his estate, you know about the Lennox property? The one on the county line? Preston thinks we should transfer it to Claudette and him and use the proceeds to set up some kind of, I don't know, structured account for Doris. Something she can't just spend. A trust. So she has something when she's older. I stood very still. She'd have to sign something acknowledging the transfer, of course. Preston has the paperwork. We were going to bring it up tonight, actually. The property's worth about $80,000. It's not nothing. $80,000. For my signature on a document that would transfer my share of a family estate to my brother and sister. I set my glass down quietly and walked back to the living room. The document appeared at 10:30, slid across the coffee table by Preston with the practiced casualness of someone who has rehearsed the gesture. "While we're all together," he said. "Just some estate housekeeping. Uncle Bart's property, it's complicated to manage a three-way interest in a piece of real estate. The simplest thing is to consolidate. We buy out your share." He tapped a number at the bottom of the first page. 82,000. Which is fair market value. I picked up the document. It was not, in fact, fair market value. I knew this because I had a subscription to a property data service that my research team used for market analysis, and I had, 3 weeks ago when Preston first mentioned some paperwork in a vague holiday email, looked up the Lennox property. It was a 6-acre parcel with road access and a buildable lot in a county where land values had increased 41% in 5 years. Actual fair market value was closer to $240,000. I also knew, because I had looked, that the parcel was adjacent to a conservation corridor that a regional land trust, one whose board I quietly supported through a donor-advised fund, had been quietly trying to assemble for 3 years. The assembly of that corridor was going to significantly increase the value of every property touching it. They were offering me $82,000 for something worth significantly more, based on documentation their own attorney had clearly not properly researched, and they had timed it for a holiday gathering where sentiment and wine and the accumulated weight of family obligation were meant to do their work. I read the document to the last page. I looked up at Preston, then at my mother, who was watching from the doorway with the careful expression of someone monitoring a transaction. "I'll need to have my attorney review this before I sign anything," I said. The temperature in the room dropped 2 degrees. "Doris." Preston's voice took on the patient, slightly strained quality of a man explaining something to someone who is making things difficult. "It's Christmas. It's a straightforward buyout. There's nothing in here that requires." "Then it'll hold until after the holiday," I said pleasantly. "I'll have my attorney look at it next week." The evening ended shortly after. I drove home in the dark, through the quiet Boston streets, past the Common and across the river and up through Cambridge, and I did not turn on the radio. I had an attorney. Her name was Priya Khatri, and she had been with me since the 2nd year of Callaway Ridge, when we were small enough that she knew every investment by name. She was meticulous and unintimidated and had a gift for reading documents the way surgeons read scans, finding exactly what was wrong and describing it without drama. I called her the next morning. "Priya, I need you to look at something. And I need you to look at the estate filing for my Uncle Bart's property in Lennox." "What am I looking for?" "I want to know if the title is clean. I want to know how the interest was distributed. And I want to know if there's anything irregular about the valuation my brother's attorney used." A pause. "How irregular are we expecting?" "I don't know yet." "That's what I need you to find out." She called me back in 4 hours. "Doris," as Priya said, in the tone she uses when she has found something that is simultaneously professionally interesting and personally significant. "Do you want the organized version or the immediate version?" "Immediate. The valuation your brother used is based on a 2019 assessment that predates the county rezoning. The actual current appraised value is $260,000. Your 1/3 interest is $86,000 at minimum. What they offered you is not technically incorrect, but it's based on stale data in a way that no competent attorney should have missed." "What else?" "The title filing for your uncle's estate. It was probated 2 years ago." She paused. "Doris, your name appears on the original will as an equal beneficiary of the real estate interest. But the final probate filing lists only Preston and Claudette as real property beneficiaries. You received a cash bequest of $12,000 instead." I was quiet. "Someone would have needed to file an amended distribution schedule," Priya continued. "There's a notarized document in the county record that authorizes the redistribution. The notary stamp is from a firm in Wellesley. Claudette lived in Wellesley. Doris, I want to be careful about what I'm inferring here, because we'd need a forensic document examiner to make this definitive. But the signature attributed to you on the amended distribution schedule, she stopped. It doesn't match your signature on the documents I have from our engagement letters. Not in my layperson's reading. And you were never contacted by the probate court to confirm the change. I sat in my office at Callaway Ridge, the real office, not the studio apartment, but the actual office, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, and looked at the water for a long moment. How much did the redistributed share represent? With current values? Your share of the Lennox property that you should have inherited is approximately $86,000. Plus, you received $12,000 in cash instead of the property interest. Net, you were shorted by roughly $74,000. How long ago was this filed? 2 years and 3 months. I closed my eyes. Uncle Bart had died 2 years ago, in the fall, during a stretch of months when I had been in the middle of a critical close on our third fund, flying between Boston and Chicago and London and barely sleeping. I had received a check. I had thought it was the cash bequest. I had not looked further. I had been too busy building a $3 billion firm to notice that my family had quietly erased my name from an inheritance. Priya, I said. I'd like you to begin preparing a full legal response. Don't contact anyone yet. I want to understand everything first. Christmas morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of Boston December day where the light is beautiful and the wind off the harbor will take your breath away if you let it. I went for a run along the waterfront. I do my best thinking in motion. My father was the same way, which was one of the things Preston didn't know about him that I did, because Preston was the one who'd inherited the office and I was the one who used to run with our father at 6 in the morning before anyone else was awake. I thought about what I wanted. Not what I could do. I was clear on what I could do. I thought about what kind of person I wanted to be at the end of this, which is a different question entirely and one that I think most people skip when they're angry. I was angry. I want to be honest about that. The thing about discovering that your family has forged your name on a legal document to cut you out of an inheritance is that it removes ambiguity. For years I had maintained a small private uncertainty. Maybe they were simply limited. Maybe they simply didn't understand. Maybe the cruelty was thoughtlessness rather than intention. A forged signature is not thoughtlessness. But anger without architecture is just noise, and I had built my entire career on converting raw information into structured decisions. So I thought about what I actually wanted, and by the time I turned back toward the harbor I had my answer. I wanted the truth to be visible. I wanted my family to understand, with complete clarity, what they had done and what it had cost them, not in the form of a confrontation, but in the form of facts presented calmly in a room with good lighting. I wanted my name back where it belonged. And I wanted, when all of it was over, to do something useful with what I'd built, something that would last longer than the anger and mean more than the settlement. I called Preston on the 26th. I've had a chance to review the document, I said. Good. His voice was the voice of a man expecting routine compliance. Any questions? A few. I'd like to meet. In person. I can come to the office on the 28th if that works. Doris, it's the week between Christmas and New Year's. Can't we just handle this by the 28th, I said. I'll bring my attorney. The pause that followed lasted 4 seconds. I counted. Fine, he said. Fine, yes. 2 o'clock. Voss Family Investments occupied the 14th floor of a building in the financial district that my father had chosen because it had a view of the harbor. He believed you should always be able to see open water from wherever you worked. It reminded you, he said, that the world was larger than the room you were in. I had not been in this building in 9 years. The receptionist, a young woman named according to her nameplate Simone, greeted me with the smooth professionalism of someone who does not know she is watching history. Priya walked beside me carrying a leather document case. I was wearing a charcoal wool suit from a tailor in the Back Bay. My boots were different from the ones I'd worn at Diane's house. Preston was in the conference room with his own attorney, a man named Garrett who I recognized from the Boston legal community as competent but not exceptional. He saw me. He saw Priya. His eyes moved to my suit, my posture, the document case, and something shifted in his face, a microscopic recalibration that lasted less than a second but that I caught, because I have spent 9 years in rooms with people who are rapidly updating their assessment of a situation. "Doris," he said. "Thanks for coming in." "Thank you for having me," I said, and sat down. Priya placed 3 documents on the table. "Before we discuss the buyout offer," I said, "I'd like to address something that came up in our review of the estate filing." Garrett leaned forward slightly. I nodded to Priya, who slid the first document across the table. It was a side-by-side comparison of 2 signatures, mine on a Callaway Ridge engagement document from 3 years ago, and the signature attributed to me on the amended probate distribution schedule. "This is a signature comparison prepared by a licensed forensic document examiner," I said. "You'll see the analysis on the second page. The conclusion is that the signature on the distribution amendment is inconsistent with my known signature in 17 specific characteristics." Preston was very still. "Additionally," I said, "I was never contacted by the probate court regarding the amended filing, which is required by Massachusetts estate law when a named beneficiary's interest is being modified. That notification either didn't happen or was intercepted." Garrett was reading the document. His expression was the expression of a man doing rapid internal calculations. "The amended filing transferred my real property interest, worth approximately $86,000 at current valuation, to Preston and Claudette, and substituted a $12,000 cash bequest. The net difference is approximately $74,000. I folded my hands on the table. "Priya, would you like to describe the legal exposure?" Priya described the legal exposure. She did it in the careful, thorough, emotionless way of someone who has described legal exposure many times and knows that the facts are more powerful without theatrical decoration. She covered probate fraud, the relevant Massachusetts statutes, the civil and potential criminal implications, and the timeline within which remedies could be sought. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Preston looked at me across the table. I saw something in his face I had never seen there before, not in 40 years of being his sister. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was the specific expression of a person encountering a reality they had believed impossible and finding that reality entirely indifferent to their disbelief. "Doris," he said. "I want you to understand that." "Preston," I said gently. "I'm not here to have a conversation about understanding. I'm here to outline a resolution." The resolution I proposed was this. The Lennox property would be transferred to me at full current appraised value, with Preston and Claudette compensating me for the difference between my actual inheritance and what I'd received. No criminal referral would be made as long as the civil resolution was complete within 60 days. I also told Preston that I would not be signing the buyout document he'd presented at Diane's house. I told him one more thing. "I'd like Diane in a call," I said. "Not today. But before this is finalized, I want to speak with her directly. Not to punish her. Because I think she deserves to understand exactly what was done and what I know, from a woman who spent her childhood being told she wasn't measuring up. Whatever she did or didn't know, she should hear it from me." Garrett was already drafting notes. Preston sat with his hands flat on the table. "Who are you?" he said. Not rudely. With something closer to genuine bewilderment. "Who do you work for?" "I run a private equity and technology investment firm," I said. "We've been operating for 7 years. Our portfolio is valued at approximately $3 billion. He stared at me. "3, he stopped. "You asked once, about 8 years ago, what my plan was. I told you I had some ideas I wanted to pursue. You said, and I'm paraphrasing, that it was very Doris of me to believe that enthusiasm was a substitute for actual expertise. I stood and picked up my coat. I've thought about that a lot over the years. I've decided it was good advice, actually. I made sure to develop the expertise. I extended my hand across the table. After a moment, he shook it. The call with Diane happened on a Thursday morning in January, 3 weeks after the meeting at Voss Family Investments. I had thought carefully about what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it. I had written notes and then set them aside, because the thing I actually needed to say didn't require notes. It required honesty, which is a different thing. She answered on the second ring. Doris. Hi, Mom. A pause. Preston told me. Her voice was careful and strange. He told me about your company. About everything. I know. Why didn't you tell us? I looked out at the harbor. A container ship was making its way toward the channel, slow and massive, leaving an almost imperceptible wake. Because I needed to know, I said, whether the way you treated me was about what I had or who I was. I needed to see what happened when you thought I had nothing. She was quiet for a long time. That's a very cold way to think about family, she said finally. Yes, I agreed. It is. You taught me to think that way, Mom. The coldness wasn't mine originally. She didn't respond to that. I don't want to hurt you, I said. I need you to understand that. I'm not doing any of this to hurt anyone. I'm doing it because I spent 35 years being the failure in this family and I need that to stop. Not for the money. Not for the property. Because the story you told about me wasn't true, and I need the record corrected. I know, she said. And then, quietly, in a voice I hadn't heard from her in years, I know it wasn't true. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a reckoning. It was a small, tired acknowledgement from a woman who had been wrong for a long time and knew it and hadn't found a way to say it until the cost became undeniable. I would take it. Not because it was enough, but because it was real, and I had decided I was going to value real things over satisfying things. I'd like to have dinner, I said. In the spring. When things are settled. Just us. Another pause. Okay, she said. The Lennox property transferred in March. I donated it, through Callaway Ridge's charitable foundation, to the regional land trust that had been quietly assembling the conservation corridor. They called it the Voss Family Conservation Preserve, which I had not asked for but which I did not object to. My grandmother had been a birder. She would have appreciated it. I also did something else, something that had been forming in my mind since that December night when I sat in my car in a parking lot off the expressway and made the drive to a house where I wasn't welcome. I established the Voss Opportunity Fund, capitalized with $5 million from my personal assets, specifically to invest in women-led startups in the early stages, the stage I had been in 9 years ago when there was no one in my family who believed in what I was building. Investments of $50,000 to $200,000. The kind of capital that is not enormous by institutional standards and is everything by human ones. The first year, we funded 11 companies. I made one rule for the fund: every founder we backed had to present their pitch to a panel that included at least 2 people who had once told them they were too ambitious, too difficult, too much, or not enough. Not so the founders could be validated by people who had underestimated them, but so those people would have to sit in a room and watch what they'd nearly prevented. Preston and I have a working relationship now. That is probably the accurate way to describe it. We had a long, difficult conversation in February that I won't characterize as a reconciliation, because reconciliation implies that we had something before that we're returning to, and I'm not sure we ever did. What we have now is honesty, which is harder and more valuable. He told me, in that February conversation, that he had always felt like he was performing for our father's approval the same way I had been performing for survival, and that somewhere in there he had started punishing me for being able to stop performing while he couldn't. I thought about that for a while. I didn't stop performing, I told him. I just started performing for myself instead of for you. He nodded slowly. I think that's what I couldn't forgive, he said. I'm telling you this story not because I want you to admire the $3 billion or the legal resolution or the conservation preserve with my grandmother's name on it. Those things are real, but they're not the point. The point is this. 9 years ago I left a room where I was being told, by someone who shared my blood and my last name, that my ideas weren't worth the paper they'd require to write down. I walked out of that building in the financial district and got in my car and sat there for a long time, the same way I sat in that parking lot in December, doing the math on what it costs to keep investing in people who are depleting you. I decided to invest somewhere else. The return on that investment is not primarily measured in dollars, though the dollars are real and they matter, and I am not going to pretend otherwise, because pretending money doesn't matter is a luxury of people who have always had enough of it. The return is measured in the 11 founders we funded last year who are building things that didn't exist before and that will outlast all of us. It's measured in the woman who called me 6 months ago to tell me that our $50,000 investment was the first time anyone had bet on her with something real. It's measured in the fact that I know, with a certainty that has nothing to do with the balance sheet, that my father, who used to run with me at 6 in the morning and tell me to always be able to see open water, would be proud. Not of the money. Of the way I used the years. If you've been the invisible one, the one who holds things together and gets dismissed, the one whose name gets quietly removed from documents while everyone is celebrating someone else, I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me on that drive to my mother's house. You do not owe anyone a performance of failure. The people who benefit from your smallness are not doing you a favor by maintaining your smallness. They are doing themselves one. Your job is not to make it comfortable for them to underestimate you. Your job is to know what you're worth with the same precision and rigor you'd apply to anything else that matters. And then, when the time comes, to walk into the room and let the numbers speak. They always speak louder than the story someone else wrote about you. Always.